has seen historic success in the Everglades.
As Fox 35's Carla Byron explains, it's helping to remove Burmese pythons from the wild in record numbers.
In 2017, Florida made a decision that made headlines for all the wrong reasons. Wildlife managers released thousands of small, foreign creatures into one of America's most fragile ecosystems. Scientists were divided. The public laughed. Late-night hosts made jokes. But 7 years later, the data coming out of the Everglades is making a lot of people go very quiet. This is not a story about a government mistake. This is a story about what happens when you look closer. There is a place in southern Florida where the water never fully dries, where the grass grows taller than a man, where the sky turns pink at dusk, and something is always moving just below the surface. The Florida Everglades is one of the most unique ecosystems on the planet. It is a slow-moving river, 60 miles wide and only inches deep, stretching from Lake Okeechobee all the way down to Florida Bay. For thousands of years, it ran on its own rules, its own balance, its own silence. That silence began to break somewhere around the 1980s. Nobody noticed at first. The Everglades is not a place where you see everything. Most of it is hidden. Most of what happens there happens quietly, in the tall grass and the dark water, far from any road or trail. But wildlife biologists started noticing something strange. Animals that had always been common in the park were getting harder to find. Marsh rabbits, raccoons, opossums, bobcats, the kinds of creatures that had lived in the Everglades for centuries were disappearing. Not slowly, quickly. It took years of trapping surveys, field studies, and careful documentation before the picture became clear. Something was eating them. Something large, something efficient, something that had never belonged in Florida at all. The Burmese python is native to Southeast Asia. In its home range, it is one apex predator among many. It has natural competitors, natural checks. It fits into a system that evolved around it over millions of years. But in Florida, it had none of that. No predators, no competition, a landscape that suited it almost perfectly. Warm, wet, full of prey that had never learned to fear a snake that size. Burmese pythons can grow to 18 feet. Some have been found longer. They are ambush hunters. They coil. They wait. They strike faster than most people can process what they are seeing. And in the Everglades, they found something rare for any invasive species. They found paradise. The most accepted theory for how they arrived involves the exotic pet trade. Florida, for decades, was a major hub for imported wildlife. Pythons were sold legally as pets throughout the 1980s and 1990s. Some were released deliberately by owners who could no longer manage them. Some escaped during Hurricane Andrew in 1992, when a breeding facility was destroyed. By the time anyone understood what was happening, the population had already taken hold. By some estimates, there are now more than 100,000 Burmese pythons in southern Florida. The Everglades had a problem it had never faced before, and for a long time, nobody had an answer. By the early 2000s, the scale of the problem was becoming impossible to ignore. Biologists were publishing studies with numbers that were difficult to read without stopping. A 2012 paper in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences documented population declines in Everglades mammals that were unlike anything recorded in a North American ecosystem in modern times. Raccoon populations had dropped by 99% in areas with high python density, opossums by 98%, bobcats by 87%. Marsh rabbits and foxes had effectively disappeared from large sections of the park entirely. These were not gradual declines. These were collapses. Florida wildlife managers tried everything they could think of. They organized python removal programs. They trained and deployed hunters. They offered bounties. They held public competitions. The Python Challenge, where registered participants could hunt pythons across the Everglades and win cash prizes. Thousands of people participated. Hundreds of snakes were removed. It made for good television. It generated enthusiasm. But when researchers looked at the actual impact on the python population. The results were sobering. The hunts barely touched the numbers. Finding a Burmese python in the Everglades, even when you are specifically looking for one, is extraordinarily difficult. They are perfectly camouflaged. They move at night. They spend long periods completely motionless in dense vegetation. Professional hunters with years of experience could walk within feet of one and never know it was there. It became clear that human hunters alone could not solve this problem. The Everglades was simply too large, too dense, and too wild. The python was too good at hiding, so scientists began to think differently. If you cannot hunt an animal into control, perhaps you need something that can find it the way no human ever could. Something that tracks by scent. Something that evolved alongside similar species in a similar landscape. Something that does not need to see the snake to know it is there. The idea of using specially trained dogs had already been explored in other invasive species contexts. Detection dogs had been used to find invasive plants, invasive insects, even invasive fish eggs. The question was whether a dog could be trained to reliably locate a large, camouflaged snake in a complex wetland environment. Early trials showed promise, but dogs were expensive to train. They tired quickly in the Florida heat. They could not cover the kind of ground the situation demanded. They were useful, but not sufficient on their own. What came next was more unconventional, far more unconventional. A small group of researchers began asking a question that, to most people, sounded like the start of a bad joke. What if the answer was not a dog at all? What if it was something much smaller? Something that people had largely overlooked. Something that, when the idea was first proposed in a serious scientific context, caused more than a few people in the room to raise an eyebrow. The proposal was unusual enough that it needed time to be taken seriously. It would take years before anyone with authority decided to act on it. And when they finally did, the reaction was almost entirely mockery. The animal at the center of this story is not impressive to look at. It does not have sharp claws or powerful jaws. It does not move fast. It does not look dangerous. If you passed one on a footpath, you would probably not give it a second glance. The Indian monitor lizard, known scientifically as Varanus bengalensis, is a medium-sized reptile native to South and Southeast Asia. It grows to about 5 feet in length. It has a long neck, a flattened head, and a forked tongue that flickers constantly, tasting the air around it. It looks, to most people, like an ordinary lizard. But what this animal does with that tongue is anything but ordinary. Monitor lizards possess one of the most sophisticated chemical detection systems in the animal kingdom. Their forked tongues collect scent particles from the air and the ground and deliver them to a sensory organ in the roof of their mouth called the Jacobson's organ. This system allows them to follow scent trails with a precision that rivals, and in some conditions exceeds, that of trained dogs. They can detect the chemical signature of a large snake from a significant distance. They can track that signature across difficult terrain, through water, through dense grass, across surfaces that would defeat most other detection methods. In their native range across South Asia, monitor lizards and large pythons share the same ecosystems. They are not strangers to each other. Monitor lizards are known to locate and consume python eggs. A single monitor lizard can destroy an entire python nest. Eating every egg before the female python can mount an effective defense. In areas where monitor lizard populations are healthy, python reproduction rates are measurably lower. This was the idea that researchers began to take seriously around 2015, not using monitor lizards as direct predators of adult pythons. The lizards are not large enough for that, but using them as nest destroyers, as egg hunters, as a biological check on python reproduction that could operate continuously across vast areas of difficult terrain, without human assistance. The research phase was careful and slow. Scientists studied monitor lizard behavior in controlled environments. They documented egg detection rates. They measured how far a lizard would travel to locate a nest. They studied whether the lizards would thrive in the Florida climate, which is similar enough to their native range to be survivable, but different in ways that needed to be understood before any release could be considered responsible. The Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission reviewed the research. Federal partners were consulted. Environmental impact assessments were conducted. The question of whether releasing a non-native species to control another non-native species could create new problems was taken seriously. It is a legitimate concern. History has examples of biological control efforts that went wrong. The cane toad introduction in Australia is perhaps the most famous. Scientists did not want to repeat that kind of mistake. After years of review, a controlled pilot program was approved. In 2017, several hundred Indian monitor lizards were released into carefully selected areas of the Everglades. The program was expanded in subsequent years. By the time the public became widely aware of it, thousands of lizards had been introduced. The reaction was swift, and it was not kind. Talk radio hosts called it absurd. Online commentators questioned whether Florida's wildlife managers had lost their minds. The idea of releasing one foreign animal to fight another struck many people as exactly the kind of bureaucratic overreach that makes headlines for all the wrong reasons. Memes circulated. Jokes were made. A recurring theme in the coverage was the image of Florida, already famous for its unusual wildlife encounters, now deliberately making things stranger. What almost none of that coverage mentioned was the data that was already starting to come in. If you value deep investigations like this, consider subscribing. Science does not move at the speed of news cycles. It moves slowly, carefully, and with a great deal of caution. Researchers do not announce results until they are confident in what the results actually mean. That is why, in the early years of the Monitor Lizard program, there was very little public information about how things were going. The silence was not secrecy. It was process. But that silence allowed the mockery to fill the space where data should have been. Behind that silence, however, something was happening in the Everglades. The first field reports came from the biological monitoring teams stationed in the pilot release zones. These were small areas, carefully chosen for their python density and their relative accessibility to researchers. Teams went out regularly to conduct surveys. They were looking for signs of python nesting activity, disturbed vegetation, scent marking, the subtle environmental signatures that indicate a large snake has been using an area for reproduction. In the zones where monitor lizards had been released, those signatures were changing. Python nesting is a complex behavior. Female Burmese pythons in Florida typically lay between 20 and 100 eggs per clutch. They coil around the eggs for the entire incubation period, which lasts roughly 2 months. During this time, the female does not eat. She uses muscular contractions to generate heat and maintain the temperature the eggs need to develop. It is an enormous investment of energy, and it is, for a brief window, a vulnerability. A nesting python is stationary, predictable, locatable. Monitor lizards, it turned out, were very good at finding that window. Field cameras placed in the release zones began capturing footage that researchers described as significant. Monitor lizards moving through the grass with purpose, following trails that were invisible to human observers, locating nest sites that the research teams themselves had not detected. In several documented cases, lizards were filmed excavating python nests and consuming the eggs before the attending female could intervene effectively. The numbers from the first 2 years were small. This was expected. The lizard population was still establishing itself. The program was still in its early phase, but the directional signal in the data was clear enough to keep the program moving forward. What was perhaps more surprising was what researchers began to notice in the broader ecosystem surrounding the release zones. Animal activity surveys, which had shown devastating declines for years, started to show something different in localized areas near the release sites. Not dramatic recoveries, not the kind of numbers that would make headlines, but movement in a direction that had not been seen in a long time. A marsh rabbit detected in an area where the species had not been recorded in over a decade. Raccoon activity returning to a section of trail where trapping surveys had come up empty for years. Small, quiet signals, the kind that a scientist treats with extreme caution because they could mean many things, but the kind that, when taken together and mapped against the locations of the monitor lizard releases, begin to suggest a pattern. The lead researchers on the program were careful in how they spoke about these early results. They used words like preliminary and indicative. They emphasized that more time and more data were needed before any firm conclusions could be drawn. They were right to be cautious. Science demands that. But some of them, speaking privately, used a different kind of language. One field biologist, in an interview that would later be cited in a university press release, described the early results as quietly exciting. That is a careful phrase, a measured phrase, but in the context of the Everglades, where the news had been nothing but bad for 30 years, quietly exciting meant something. It meant the data was pointing somewhere nobody had quite expected. There is a concept in ecology called a trophic cascade. It is not a complicated idea, but its implications are profound. When a single species changes its behavior, or its population, in a significant way, the effects do not stay contained to that species. They move through the food web like a current through water. They touch animals and plants that seem completely unrelated. They reshape entire landscapes in ways that can take years to fully understand. The most famous example is what happened in Yellowstone when wolves were reintroduced in 1995. The wolves changed where elk grazed. That changed which plants grew. That changed the course of rivers. One predator, one decision, an entire ecosystem altered. What was beginning to happen in the Everglades was something similar, but quieter, and in some ways, more complex. The Burmese python had not simply removed prey animals from the Everglades. It had disrupted relationships that had existed for thousands of years. Relationships between predator and prey, between grazer and plant, between seed disperser and tree, between nesting bird and ground cover. When you remove the mammals that eat certain plants, those plants grow unchecked. When you remove the animals that disperse seeds, certain trees stop reproducing effectively. When you remove the small predators that keep rodent populations in balance, rodent behavior changes. Everything is connected. And when the python broke those connections, the damage was not just in the species it ate directly. The monitor lizard program was not designed with trophic cascades in mind. It was designed to reduce python egg survival rates. That was the goal. Narrow, specific, measurable. But as the lizard population established itself and began operating across wider areas of the release zones, researchers started observing effects that went beyond the original scope of the program. Python females that had previously nested in predictable seasonal patterns began showing signs of behavioral disruption. Females that had successfully nested in certain areas for multiple seasons were abandoning those sites. This is significant because Burmese pythons, like many large reptiles, show strong site fidelity. They return to the same areas. When something disrupts that pattern, it suggests a level of environmental pressure that is affecting decision-making at the individual animal level. Disrupted nesting means disrupted reproduction. Disrupted reproduction, sustained over multiple seasons, means population pressure from below, not from removing adult snakes, which remained extraordinarily difficult, but from reducing the number of juveniles entering the population each year. At the same time, something else was happening that nobody had fully predicted. The presence of monitor lizards in the ecosystem was affecting python movement patterns. Pythons are not social animals. They do not communicate the way mammals do, but they are sensitive to chemical signals in their environment. Researchers hypothesized, and field data began to support, that the chemical presence of monitor lizards in an area created a low-level stress signal for pythons already using that territory. Not enough to drive them away entirely, but enough to alter their behavior in measurable ways. Less time spent in one location. More movement. More exposure. A python that moves more is a python that is easier to find. And a python that is easier to find is a python that python removal hunters can actually catch. The monitor lizard program, designed to attack the python population from one angle, was inadvertently creating advantages at multiple points in the chain. It was making the ecosystem work against the python in ways that no single intervention could have achieved alone. Ecologists have a word for this kind of unexpected benefit. They call it a co-benefit, something gained that was not the primary target of an intervention. In public health, a co-benefit might be that a program designed to reduce air pollution also reduces rates of childhood asthma. In ecology, it looks like this. A lizard released to eat eggs ends up changing the behavior of the snake itself. The chain reaction was real, and it was only beginning. If you value deep investigations like this, consider subscribing. In science, 3 years is not a long time for a program operating inside one of the most complex ecosystems in North America. 3 years is barely enough to establish a baseline. Researchers know this. They say it often. They build it into every public statement they make about ongoing fieldwork. But 3 years is also enough time for patterns to emerge. Enough time for numbers to start telling a story. And by 2020, the data coming out of the Everglades monitor lizard release zones had accumulated to a point where it was no longer possible to dismiss what it was showing. The University of Florida, in partnership with the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission, published a series of field reports between 2020 and 2022 that drew careful, qualified, but unmistakable conclusions. In the primary release zones, python nest detection rates by monitor lizards was significantly higher than detection rates achieved by human survey teams working the same areas. The lizards were finding nests that trained researchers were missing. Not occasionally, consistently, egg predation rates in those zones had reached levels that, if sustained, would mathematically result in a meaningful reduction in juvenile python recruitment over a 10-year period. This is the kind of language scientists use when they want to say something is working without overstating what the data supports. Meaningful reduction in juvenile recruitment means fewer young pythons surviving to reproductive age. Fewer reproductive adults means a slower growing population. A slower growing population, combined with continued adult removal efforts, means the overall number begins to move in a different direction for the first time in decades. That was not a small finding. That was the first credible evidence that the python population in any part of the Everglades could be pushed into decline rather than simply slowed in its growth. The mammal survey data from the same period added another layer to the picture. In 3 of the 5 primary release zones, species that had been functionally absent for years were showing confirmed detections. Marsh rabbits in 2 zones, white-tailed deer activity increasing in 1 zone, where python predation pressure had been documented as extremely high for over a decade. Raccoon trapping indices, a standard measure of relative population density, moving upward for the first time since comprehensive monitoring began. These recoveries were not uniform. They were not dramatic. In 2 of the 5 zones, the mammal data showed no meaningful change. Researchers were honest about this. The program was not working equally everywhere. Terrain differences, python density variations, and the time it takes for a monitor lizard population to reach effective operational density all played a role in why some areas responded faster than others. But the zones that were responding in a way that matched the ecological model researchers had built before the program began. The model had predicted that if egg predation rates could be sustained above a certain threshold, mammal recovery would follow within a predictable time frame. The data was tracking that model with a closeness that surprised even the researchers who had designed it. There was one additional finding in the 3-year data that received almost no attention in public reporting, but that several researchers described as the most interesting result of the entire program. In the release zones, where monitor lizard populations had reached their highest densities, herpetological surveys began detecting a species that had not been reliably recorded in those areas for years. The American alligator, always present in the broader Everglades, was showing increased activity, specifically in areas of high monitor lizard concentration. The hypothesis that emerged was careful and preliminary. Alligators are opportunistic predators. They eat what is available, in areas where python disturbance was reducing overall prey availability. Alligator foraging patterns had shifted, but in areas where the ecosystem was beginning to stabilize, where small mammals were returning and prey diversity was increasing. Alligator activity was concentrating. The ecosystem was not just recovering in isolated pockets. It was beginning, in small and tentative ways, to reconnect. The data was saying something that 3 years earlier would have seemed impossible to say with any confidence. It was saying the gamble might be paying off. Florida has a reputation. It is the state where strange things happen, where wildlife encounters make national news, where the combination of heat, water, and human activity produces stories that seem too unusual to be real. That reputation has followed Florida's wildlife management decisions for decades, and it followed the Monitor Lizard program from the moment it became public knowledge. The jokes wrote themselves. Florida, unable to solve one invasive species problem, had decided to create another one. But underneath, that easy mockery was a more serious conversation happening in wildlife management circles across the country. A conversation that was considerably less comfortable than the jokes suggested. The United States has an invasive species problem that extends far beyond the Everglades. Across the country, non-native species introduced through the pet trade, agricultural imports, shipping container stowaways, and deliberate releases are costing the American economy an estimated $26 billion per year in damages and control efforts. That number comes from a 2021 analysis published in the journal Nature. It is not a Florida number. It is a national number, and it is growing. In the Great Lakes, Asian carp introduced decades ago have devastated native fish populations and resisted billions of dollars in containment efforts. In the Pacific Northwest, invasive green crabs are destroying eelgrass beds that serve as nursery habitat for dozens of native species. In the Southeast, feral hogs cause an estimated $1.5 billion in agricultural damage every year and have proven almost entirely resistant to conventional control methods. Across Hawaii, invasive species are the primary driver of native bird extinctions, a crisis that has been building for over a century with no clear solution in sight. Every one of these situations has something in common with the Everglades python problem. Conventional control methods, hunting, trapping, poisoning, barrier construction, have proven insufficient. The scale of the problem exceeds the scale of the tools being applied to it. And yet, in almost every case, the response from wildlife managers in affected states has been to continue doing what has not been working rather than to seriously consider biological control as an alternative. The reasons for this resistance are not entirely irrational. Biological control has a troubled history. The introduction of the cane toad into Australia in 1935 to control agricultural beetles is the example that comes up in almost every discussion of the subject. The cane toad ignored the beetles and instead spread across the continent, poisoning native predators and disrupting ecosystems in ways that are still being managed today. The mongoose introduction in Hawaii, intended to control rats in sugarcane fields, similarly failed its original purpose while causing catastrophic damage to ground-nesting bird populations. These examples are real. Their consequences were severe, and they have cast a long shadow over biological control as a management strategy, making wildlife agencies deeply cautious about any proposal that involves releasing a non-native species, regardless of how carefully it has been studied. What Florida's program represented, however, was something different from those historical failures. It was not a rushed decision made under agricultural pressure with limited ecological research. It was a years-long, carefully reviewed process that drew on modern ecological modeling, controlled trials, and a detailed understanding of the target species and the release species that simply did not exist when the cane toad was introduced. The science behind the Monitor Lizard program was not perfect. No science is, but it was rigorous in a way that earlier biological control efforts had not been. Wildlife managers in other states know this. The research is not hidden. The field reports are publicly available. The methodology has been presented at conferences and reviewed by independent ecologists. And the early results, while preliminary, are being watched closely by people in agencies far outside Florida. But watching closely is not the same as acting, and the gap between what the data is suggesting and what other states are willing to consider doing about their own invasive species crises reveals something uncomfortable. It reveals that the barrier is not entirely scientific. It is political. It is reputational. It is the fear of becoming the next Florida, the next punchline, the next cautionary tale about government overreach and unintended consequences. What that fear is costing those states in ecological damage and economic losses that compound every year is a question that is becoming harder to avoid. There is a moment in every long scientific investigation when the data stops being just numbers and starts being a mirror, a reflection of choices made, risks taken, and assumptions challenged. Florida reached that moment quietly, without ceremony, somewhere in the middle of a field report that most people will never read. But what that moment revealed has implications that stretch far beyond the Everglades, far beyond Florida, and far beyond the specific question of what to do about a very large invasive snake. The world is facing an invasive species crisis of a scale that most people do not fully appreciate. The International Union for Conservation of Nature lists invasive species as the second leading cause of biodiversity loss globally, behind only habitat destruction. A 2023 report from the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services estimated that invasive species have contributed to 60% of all recorded animal and plant extinctions since the 1500. The economic cost globally is estimated at over $400 billion per year. These are not abstract numbers. They represent ecosystems collapsing, fisheries disappearing, agricultural systems failing, and native species vanishing from landscapes they occupied for millions of years. Conventional control methods are losing this fight. That is not a controversial statement among ecologists. It is an observation supported by decades of field data from every continent on Earth. Hunting reduces populations locally and temporarily. Trapping is labor-intensive and scale-limited. Chemical control causes collateral damage to non-target species. Barrier construction works in some contexts and fails in others. None of these tools, applied alone or in combination, has successfully eliminated a well-established invasive species from a large, complex ecosystem. What Florida demonstrated, imperfectly and incompletely, but demonstrably, is that biological control, when approached with modern ecological rigor, with years of controlled research, with careful species selection, with ongoing monitoring and adaptive management, can produce results that conventional methods cannot. Not a silver bullet, not a guaranteed solution, but a meaningful intervention in a situation where all other interventions had failed. The implications of that demonstration are significant. Countries in Southeast Asia dealing with invasive predators threatening endemic bird species. Island nations in the Pacific watching native reptile populations collapse under pressure from introduced rats and cats. African nations managing the spread of invasive plants that are choking water systems and reducing grazing land. All of these situations involve ecosystems